December 29, 2006, London. Inside the British Treasury, a civil servant processes a routine payment. No ceremony, no headlines, just numbers moving between accounts. The recipient is the United States Treasury. The amount is $83 million. With this transfer, a file is closed. A debt is finished. It began 60 years earlier in the shadow of a world war Britain technically won. To the clerk, this is bookkeeping. To history, it is the final heartbeat of an empire. Because this payment was not for bombs or bullets, it was not for tanks or planes, it was for food, for survival. Britain had borrowed money after World War II to prevent its people from starving, and in 2006, long after Churchill, long after Roosevelt, long after the empire itself, Britain was still paying. The original loan was $3.75 billion. By the time the last check cleared, Britain had paid back double that amount. But the loan was only the visible surface, the foam on top of a much deeper transfer. Before Britain ever received that money, it had already sold off its gold, its overseas investments, its future income, its strategic position, factories, mines, railways, entire markets. Assets built over centuries were liquidated in a matter of months, not by conquest, not by invasion, but by contracts signed under pressure. When you tally it all up, the gold shipped across the Atlantic, the investments sold at fire sale prices, the naval bases leased away for nearly a century, the trade system dismantled piece by piece, the total wealth transferred from Britain to America between 1940 and 2006 approaches $450 billion in today's money. For perspective, the Marshall Plan, celebrated as the greatest act of American generosity in history, cost less than half of that. America extracted more wealth from Britain alone than it gave to all of Europe combined. And Britain was the ally. Britain was the partner. Britain was on the winning side. This is the paradox at the heart of the modern world, the war that ended empires without firing a shot at them. The British Empire did not collapse on the battlefield. It was quietly foreclosed in the ledger books of the 20th century. This is the story of how global power changed hands, not through armies marching, but through balance sheets shifting, not through conquest, but through credit. In 1939, Britain still looked eternal, a quarter of the planet shaded pink on the map. Ports, railways, mines, and shipping lanes stitched together by the pound sterling. London was the center of global finance. The pound was the world's reserve currency. Money flowed inward, interest payments from Argentina, copper profits from Chile, dividends from factories in America itself. The empire didn't just rule territory, it owned income. Every year, overseas investments generated hundreds of millions of dollars, the invisible engine that paid for Britain's imports. Because Britain had a secret weakness, it did not feed itself. An island nation, industrial and urban, Britain imported more than half of its food and almost all of its raw materials: oil, steel, rubber, aluminum. The empire worked because global trade never stopped. Ships arrived, ships departed, money balanced the books. Then war broke the rhythm. When Germany invaded Poland, Hitler did not need to defeat Britain on land, he only needed to starve it. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, merchant ships vanished beneath the waves, ports burned. Every sunk cargo ship was not just a military loss, it was a subtraction from Britain's bloodstream. To survive, Britain needed imports at a scale never seen before: planes, tanks, fuel, food. There was only one supplier capable of delivering it all: the United States. But America in 1939 was neutral, suspicious, isolationist. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts: no loans, no credit, no favors. There was only cash and carry. Britain could buy American goods if it paid immediately in cash and transported everything on its own ships, no exceptions. This rule turned survival into a countdown clock. Every shipment drained Britain's reserves. Gold left the vaults, dollars left the accounts, and when cash ran out, only assets remained. This is the moment where empires reveal what they truly are, not flags or ceremonies, not history books or speeches, but portfolios. Because when Britain needed food more than pride, it began selling the very assets that made it powerful in the first place. And once an empire starts liquidating itself, the ending is no longer in doubt. Between September 1939 and December 1940, Britain entered what officials later called a controlled demolition. The first thing to go was gold. In a secret operation known as Operation Fish, Britain loaded billions of dollars worth of gold bars onto warships under cover of darkness. The treasure crossed a submarine-infested Atlantic, not to hide from Germany, but to pay America. This was the largest physical transfer of wealth in human history. An empire converting centuries of accumulated power into bullion, then shipping it away, bar by bar. When the gold was gone, Britain turned inward. Citizens were ordered to surrender American stocks and bonds. Private wealth became public collateral. Those securities were sold on Wall Street, flooding the market. Prices fell. Buyers knew Britain had no choice. Then came the most painful sales of all. Britain began liquidating its overseas investments, railroads in Argentina, mines in Africa, factories in the United States itself. These assets were not luxuries, they were income. Every dividend paid for food, every interest payment balanced trade. Selling them was like burning the furniture to heat the house. By the end of 1940, Britain had exhausted nearly everything that could be quickly sold. Gold was gone, securities gone, income streams severed. Yet the war was only getting worse. Orders for American supplies kept piling up, planes already built, ships already loaded. $3 billion Britain could not pay. This is when Winston Churchill wrote to Franklin Roosevelt. The letter was polite, formal, restrained, but beneath the language was desperation. Britain was broke. Roosevelt understood the stakes. If Britain collapsed, Germany would dominate Europe. If Europe fell, America would eventually stand alone. But Roosevelt also faced a trap of his own. The law forbade loans. The public opposed intervention. Congress feared being dragged into another European war. Any aid had to look like business, not charity. The solution was called Lend-Lease. Publicly, Roosevelt described it as neighborly kindness, a man lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. Privately, it was something else entirely. Because hoses get returned, empires do not. And before a single dollar flowed, America wanted proof that Britain had already stripped itself bare, not as an ally, but as a debtor. The man enforcing this logic was Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau was not cruel. He genuinely wanted Britain to defeat Hitler. But he was exacting, methodical, unsentimental. Before America would extend Lend-Lease, Morgenthau demanded an audit of the British Empire. Not a summary, not assurances, a full inventory. Every gold bar, every foreign investment, every factory, every share owned by British citizens anywhere in the world. The British delegation was stunned. They had come as allies in a shared existential war. They were treated like a bankrupt corporation in receivership. Morgenthau's position was simple. If Britain still owned assets, then Britain could still pay. And if Britain could still pay, American taxpayers should not. The British protested. Selling long-term investments during a war meant fire sale prices. Stripping income-generating assets would leave Britain destitute after victory. Morgenthau did not disagree, he simply did not care. The most infamous example was a company called American Vicose. It was the largest rayon producer in the United States, highly profitable, strategically important, and it was owned by a British firm. To Morgenthau, this was unacceptable. Why should dividends from American industry flow to a bankrupt empire asking for aid? He gave Britain an ultimatum: sell the company or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. There was no leverage, no alternative supplier, no time. So Britain seized the company and sold it to American investors. Everyone knew Britain was desperate, so the price was brutal. The company was worth far more than it fetched. Britain received roughly half its real value. The proceeds went straight back to the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons already ordered. Aid recycled through liquidation. And this was not an exception, it was the model. While Lend-Lease was negotiated, another deal was struck quietly in parallel. Britain needed destroyers. German submarines were sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. The U.S. Navy had 50 aging World War I destroyers sitting idle, obsolete, slow. Roosevelt offered them, in exchange for 99-year leases on British naval and air bases across the Atlantic: Newfoundland, Bermuda, Jamaica, Trinidad, the Bahamas, a chain of strategic outposts spanning the hemisphere. Britain received aging ships, America received a permanent military footprint. By the time Lend-Lease was approved in March 1941, Britain had already been stripped to the frame. Gold gone, assets sold, bases leased. Only then did the aid begin to flow. Lend-Lease kept Britain alive, that much is undeniable. From 1941 to 1945, ships crossed the Atlantic carrying food, fuel, weapons, the material oxygen of modern war. Without it, Britain would have been starved into surrender. But buried deep inside the agreement was a clause that would outlive the war itself. Article 7. It sounded harmless, abstract, diplomatic. Britain agreed that after the war, it would eliminate discriminatory treatment in international commerce. This was not a footnote, it was a death sentence written in legal language, because discriminatory treatment meant imperial preference. For decades, the British Empire had functioned as a closed economic circuit. Empire countries bought British goods, British factories stayed busy, the pound stayed strong. Imperial preference was not just policy, it was the skeleton of the empire. By signing Article 7, Britain agreed to dismantle it. Churchill hated the clause. British negotiators warned it would destroy post-war recovery, but the alternative was immediate starvation. So Britain signed. While British factories produced only weapons, American factories produced weapons and consumer goods. American corporations expanded into markets Britain had abandoned. By 1945, the war was won and the transfer was complete. $16 billion in overseas assets sold. Gold reserves nearly gone. Imperial preference scheduled for demolition. Strategic bases leased for a century. Then came the moment that revealed everything. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The war was over. 7 days later, the United States terminated Lend-Lease. Immediately, completely. Ships carrying food to Britain were ordered to turn around mid-Atlantic. No transition, no grace period. Britain's economy, engineered entirely around wartime supply lines, seized up overnight. John Maynard Keynes did the math. The numbers were unforgiving. Without aid, Britain would face mass unemployment, food shortages, and social collapse. There was only one option left: beg for a loan. In Washington, Britain sent its greatest economist to do what armies could not. John Maynard Keynes arrived exhausted, ill, and outmatched. He argued not for charity, but for justice. Britain had stood alone. Britain had bled first. Britain had bankrupted itself to hold the line while America waited. He asked for a grant. America offered a loan. $3.75 billion, just enough to prevent starvation. And it came with conditions. The most destructive was convertibility. Britain would make the pound freely exchangeable for dollars. Keynes knew what would happen. Everyone would dump pounds, eye dollars, drain the loan in weeks. He warned them. He begged them. Britain accepted anyway, because hunger is louder than pride. In 1947, the run began. Sterling collapsed. The loan evaporated. Britain suspended convertibility in humiliation, then devalued the pound, an empire quietly admitting it was no longer rich. And the debt remained. For 60 years, Britain paid, through recessions and booms, through changing governments. The final payment came in 2006, a victory finally paid for. But the story does not end with Britain. At Bretton Woods, the same logic became doctrine. The dollar as global anchor, the IMF as enforcer, loans with conditions, privatization, asset sales, market opening. The British experiment became the global template. Britain did not lose World War II. It lost the peace, not to bombs, but to balance sheets. Because power in the modern world is not seized, it is financed, and empires no longer fall, they default.